So looking at this storm, there was no way we were going to get through it with a 78-foot mast not getting a lightning strike. Then I started to pray. And there'd be no atheists on that boat who would deny God when they saw the storm part. And we sailed through and then it shut. And we're talking 40,000 foot high cumulonimbus. It just didn't happen. And if your eyes fooled you and you thought maybe we got through it without, maybe the boat pushed the atmosphere apart or something, we saw it happen on radar. On the radar you could see the gap open up that we sailed through. So, the one thing about these adventures, and this is what we call men to do, to get out there, get into the wilds, because you'll certainly meet your maker. And I'm not saying that we all need a near-death experience, but it's at that edge where you're really going to meet your maker. If your business is failing and you're praying about it and it turns around, you can always convince yourself that maybe it was going to happen anyway. But when you see a wild animal that is trying to kill you, walk away because of prayer. There is no doubt in your mind that there's a maker, there's a God that's done that for you.
When you started off, you lived in where, and you had to escape there with your family. Just roll that out quickly, because we want to get on to the tsunami, what you did in the tsunami, and there's some good stuff further to get into.
I was born in a little town called Kitale, hence Kit's name, which is just over the border from Uganda. Family were living there. My father was a veterinary officer there. Anyway, I was 5 years of age, and Idi Amin had been in power for some time. For those who don't know him, he was a crazy dictator. We had a river in front of the house, and the folks decided it was time to go when we had bodies floating past on a daily basis. Father gets a phone call from a guy and says, "You need to leave tomorrow." And he heeded his advice. He was a guy that he'd given a guitar to, which is another long story, a year before. The guy was a commander in Idi Amin's army. We packed a Cessna 175 and started a long flight to Townsville the next day. That afternoon, a contingent of soldiers came in and machine gunned 20 years of cattle breeding, wiped the whole herd out, and burnt all the buildings. So we were very lucky to get out.
And you eventually got over to Indonesia, didn't you? You lived there, didn't you? And then you got to be able to speak Indonesian.
The folks had a pretty checkered history. They were in Townsville for a while and then back up to Indonesia. So my schooling was all over the place, but I learned Indonesian along the way.
And so what happened when the tsunami hit? Tell the boys about that.
Was it Christmas, Boxing Day 94, 95? We're sitting there getting images out of Indonesia, and I felt a real strong voice say, "You need to get up there." And I said to my wife, Sarah, I'll pack my gear and I'll be off tomorrow.
And the officials were saying no one goes in. How'd you get in?
I got into Singapore and then flew to Medan, and just before I got to Medan, a buffalo had been hit by Hercules on the runway, and it shut down the runway, so there was no flying in or out. Even the army weren't getting in. So I paid a guy I think it was about $50 to drive me in. And the day before, a Japanese doctor had a throat slit on the highway that I went through by freedom fighters. So that road was meant to be closed, but the fella put me under a blanket and drove me in.
And so you've got in, and you've been part of the medical team. How come you got to be part of the medical team?
Well, it was a mate of mine who's likewise a bit of a nutter, and he was up there with Christian surfers actually just handing out food parcels. And it was amazing because you had these staunch Muslim camps where initially they didn't even want a Christian to touch them. And they wouldn't eat food that was handed out by Christian organisations. But he was breaking down those barriers, and eventually they'd go in at night and just tuck blankets on these guys. And amazing. But on one of these food drops, I saw a French doctor struggling without an interpreter to treat a guy's wound from corrugated iron. And I leant over and explained what he was trying to say, and she grabbed me and said, "Do not go." And I spent the next 10 days with her.
What were you actually doing then for 10 days? What?
Basically, I was doing basic nursing care and a little bit of veterinary work on people, but mainly...
So we had the real doctor before. This bloke might be cheaper with some of those operations as a vet on animals.
You might be missing a couple of balls when I'm finished with it.
what visually and spiritually, what did you see and encounter? We only see things on television. What really did you see?
It was an amazing thing because the doctor would get a guy and say, how did you do that injury? And it might be what I cut down to the bone on your arm from a corrugated iron cut. And the guy would turn to me with tears in his eye and go, I was holding my 3-year-old baby while hanging on to a coconut tree floating with the debris. A corrugated iron cut, piece of corrugated iron came up and just lacerated my arm to a point that the arm was useless. And I heard her scream for about 3 minutes and then I never saw her again. And then I'd turn to the doctor and go, it's a corrugated iron cut, he'll need tetanus, he'll need stitches, rah. And I would take on that pain and it would happen 250 times a day for 10 days. And when I got home, one of the lasting images was one of the wealthy suburbs of Banda Aceh had been hit the worst because it was right on the coast. And it was an area probably 3 suburbs of Brisbane wide, and it had been levelled. It was just basically rubble about a metre high, and you could not walk without stepping on the dead. My boot would make a noise, and you'd look down, and your boot was inside the chest cavity of a man who died in his kitchen. And there were 250,000 dead in that one town. And when I went in there, it was the first time I actually heard. You could actually hear the spirit realm rejoicing. There was a cackling, and as close as I've ever been to a complete absence of God. And that really taught me that if we can hear that side, then the other side is just as joyous. You know, the joy and the great things of life that are sponsored by God.
Can you just run us that one? Just run that again, because like in our day-to-day life, we don't get to think about that. Just
one of the greatest tricks I think that the dark side has is to convince us that it doesn't exist. And in our day-to-day life, we're so sanitised and urbanised that we don't practice the dark arts. Or, you know, in the third world, it's very recognised that there are black magic and voodoo and things that have power. In the Western world, we try and sanitise that. This is the first time in my life where I physically heard the cackling and the joy over all these dead people and the way that they had died, which was so violent, and the images that flash back in my mind for so many years.
So medically, what was your head like? You're a vet, you come home, you've experienced this, you come back here. What was happening to your head, and then what was hatapening to you in your spirit? What was the moment?
I certainly went through a period where I couldn't even take the kids to the beach because, Katali would float and I'd have images of babies floating past and soldiers pulling babies out of the water. I had a very bad period. A couple of the guys I knew up there, their marriages fell apart. They turned to drink. I was very lucky in that my wife sat with me. Xbox was my outlet. I'd play Xbox till 3, 4 in the morning and, shoot 'em up games. And she was starting to really worry about me. And so much so that she smashed the Xbox. And but it was basically an alternative to sleep. Sleep is when the demons replayed in your mind. And it was through her sending me back to Aceh 3 months later to find a guy called Haladin, who I carried out of a school with tetanus. And the next day when I went to the hospital to find him, he was gone. She said to me, listen, you've had 3 months with no sleep. You're a mess. I think you need to go back and close this. And anyway, that's another story. But I did go back and we found Haladin, and I get text from him today, and that was closure.
And so God did a job on you. You sorted your family business life out. You took a complete change, and you see things in a different perspective, and you still got this crazy adventure in you. Just talk about the change, how you downscaled your business, sold part of your business, and you see things in a different light.
You do. I mean, pre-Aceh, I was like every Aussie bloke. I thought I had it all together and fairly balanced. But when I met Haladin, who I stood where he stood, the day that he heard the tsunami coming, they'd had a real rattle at about 8:30 in the morning, and they ran outside. And because their house was made of fairly flexible wood and thatch, it had survived the earthquake, but they stood there and saw out to sea a white wave coming, and by the time it hit their valley, which is an A-shaped valley, They're right in the apex of this valley. It had grown to 90 feet. And he held his wife, his 2 daughters and his son, and they just got hit by a 90-foot whale of black water full of corrugated iron and nails. And he never saw his children again, never saw his wife again. He had multiple lacerations. He looked like he'd gone through a combine harvester when I found him, mainly because of the corrugated iron he'd swum with. And he showed incredible courage, but the one thing he said to me, and he never said to me, you need to do this. I just watched. There was no one there that I interviewed over those many days of interviewing. He said to me, I really miss that car. I really miss my motorbike. I really miss my house. It was all about, I wish I'd said that I loved you to my son, or I wish I had spent more time with my friend. I wish I'd told my wife that I loved her.